We're continuing on with the post-Trent church. And in 1583, there was an Italian missionary. He's a Jesuit. In my opinion, he's one of the most important missionaries in all of history. But his name is Matteo Ricci. And he arrived in Macau because he was going to do missionary work in China. He had an exceptional education, and he was very strongly educated in mathematics, cosmology, astronomy, as well as the rather theology for his ordination. He was a Jesuit, and while he was there in Macau, the first thing he did was adopt the lifestyle and the education, the lifestyle rather, and the learning of the Chinese language. He took the clothing and lifestyle of what is called an educated wise man. In China, there are certain people who the key to them is their education, and they dress in a certain way. If you're involved in the government, you dress in a certain way. In fact, if you've watched movies oftentimes on China, you notice they all have these complicated hats and they're all slightly different. They will tell you exactly their position in the government. That clothing was very much a part of this. So he took it as a learned wise man, and then he began an extensive study of the teachings of Confucius and the other Chinese wise people in history. He went into China. It was a very complicated process. He went into the edge of China near Macau. And once he was in there, he began to work. He always wanted to see the emperor. And he began to work, and it took many, many years for him to work closer and closer to Beijing. In China, your importance was how close you were to the emperor. So you'd have to go through a certain process in order to even be able to move close to the area of Beijing. And once you moved there, your chances of getting in the Forbidden City were practically nil. And once you got in the Forbidden City, that was no guarantee you'd ever be in the court of the emperor. But Ricci eventually even reached the court of the emperor. And the emperor was deeply impressed, particularly with his knowledge of astronomy. And as a result of that, he was given a permission no Westerner had ever received, and it was the permission to teach the faith in China. And his ministry was remarkably successful. By his death, he brought about 2,500 people into the faith. Several other religious orders began to attack his work in China. I don't know whether they were angry that he was so successful and they had not been able to get in there, or this was part of the anti-Jesuit movement that was going on in the world. I don't really know. But they taught that he was corrupting the faith by becoming so Chinese. Today, such an enculturation is recognized as a necessary element of missionary work. The most important knowledge that Ricci brought to China from the Chinese perspective was astrology. Their calendar is organized on a very complicated astronomical plan. And so to this day, the Confucian calendar is organized by Ricci's calculations. And just as an example, if you enter a Confucian temple, one of the things in the temple is a series of standing figures. I think maybe there's 7, but I don't remember. But they represent virtues, and they're actually human beings who represented these virtues. But if you go down the thing, and I tell you to look for it because it's easy to kind of miss it, but if you go down the figures, you'll find one of them is a man that if you look at very carefully is quite obviously not Chinese. He has a big, full beard, whereas the Chinese tend to have straggly beards, the other figures. And that man actually is Ricci. And Ricci represents wisdom in the Confucian temples. The other thing about him that is remarkable, his face is on one of the denominations of Chinese money and stayed there through the entire Cultural Revolution and everything in China. And he's still on one of their denominations. I don't remember which it is. On one of their denominations is the face of Ricci. He was just amazing in his ability to guess. You know, when we study in our tradition the teachings of Jesus and what Jesus was about and everything, we have a very high regard for poverty. And so someone like Francis of Assisi could greatly impress us as living this life of absolute poverty, even if we didn't know that the fact he came out of a wealthy family, but he was actually living this life. When you begin to study cultures, you discover that it is very different. In China, there is no great honor connected to being really poor, because if you are, you're regarded as uneducated and not having a background. Same thing's true in India. So if you notice, when Christian missionaries go into China, historically they establish themselves as wise men and wore the clothing and everything of that rank in society. They were very successful. It's not the issue today. The issue today is simply that they're Catholic clergy, because they know Catholic clergy are educated and everything. But in the past, it was that thing. And the same thing when you went into Indian society, you wore the clothing of a Brahmin, which is the highest Indian class. But they regarded the Brahmins as the ones teaching and understanding religion. And so if you wanted to do something with religion, you had to do that. So one of the key things about missionaries now is that when you go into an area, you are to enculturate yourself before you go in the area. Whereas if you look at the missions in California, they tried to enculturate the natives into Spanish culture and develop it. But it's a very, very different way of looking at it. And again, Ricci was remarkably successful as an individual bringing the faith. And in many ways, I think when we look back now, Ricci himself was at times more significant than the faith he brought. And he never converted the emperor, but the emperor understood who he was and everything and allowed him to teach it. In 1600, Robert de Bruyle, a Jesuit, went into India. There had been many missionaries in the country. If you remember, according to tradition, the faith was established there by the Apostle Thomas. And as time went on, Francis Xavier went there. And neither one of these individuals had a huge amount of success. Francis Xavier converted a huge number of people. But if you know the population of India, that's not a big deal, okay? And so Francis Xavier did conversions there, did conversions in China and different areas, Japan and other areas. But Francis Xavier was a very successful missionary. But on the whole, he wasn't quite that successful as he could have been in India. But what happened was when Robert de Bruyle went over, like Ricci, he set about adopting Indian customs. He dressed himself as a Brahmin monk and began to live the lifestyle of a Brahmin. Very soon, he was surrounded by learned Brahmins who were interested in his teachings. The Hindu faith is very, very different than the way the Christian faith is structured. In the Indian faith, you don't have a hierarchy. People come up in the society, Brahmins, come up in the society leadership by their ability to teach. And they live a certain lifestyle. But like, for instance, you look at the Buddhist community. The Buddhist community all comes from a Hindu Brahmin, Buddha. he was a Hindu Brahmin. And as you would rise and give teachings different than the other Brahmins, they wouldn't be seen as heretical. Like in our tradition, that would be heretical. But in their tradition, it is not. And so he was recognized as being a Brahmin, and these other major teachers would listen to him for his wisdom and his explanations. He discussed the Hindu sacred books and explained their meaning and understanding, and used interesting notions from Christian teachings that helped to understand these passages. Like, see, that's kind of the way we go today. Like, if you were to go into the Muslim community, the adjective the Muslims use most frequently of God is compassionate. They say the compassionate one, the compassionate Lord, the compassionate God. They use the term compassionate. Well, it's very easy to teach from our Christian scriptures the compassion of God. And if you were working with a Muslim community, it would be important that you understood why we hold God as compassionate. And so the idea today is, if we believe truthfully there is only one truth, one God, all that, then what is building these other faiths must be recognizable in our own. And so we try and find these things that bring us together rather than arguing things that separate us, and allow this to draw us together until we reach a point, where you really trust someone and like them. You can discuss things you completely disagree about, but that is not the place to start, ever. So anyway, he began to convert large numbers and was attacked by those who thought he was corrupting the faith. Okay? Same thing. First of all, he's a Jesuit, always suspect. Secondly, he's taking on all these Indian customs. And thirdly, he's accepted by the leaders of the religion as a leader of the religion. So, another objection that was worked out only among the wealthy. Another objection was that he worked only among the wealthy. This is something the Jesuits have done consistently, that they believe in their background that the real way to affect a society is, in fact, to be able to affect the leaders. So that you'll oftentimes find the Jesuits open schools, and they're very hard schools to get in. Hard because of money at times, hard because of the level of studies and this sort of stuff. And they're excellent teachers. But they realize that by doing that, they're going to educate the leaders for the society, and that they can do a lot for the faith that way. Gregory XV refused to condemn Robert, but encouraged missionaries to work among the poor more as an order of, in order to combat this attack on him. The problem was in India that you had to limit where you worked with people because of the caste system. If you worked at the Untouchables, you could not talk to the Brahmins. If you worked with the Brahmins, you had no contact with the Untouchables. Up until Gandhi, India stratification was so complete that no one in one caste would meet anyone in the other caste. They were totally thing. Gandhi, who, isn't that long ago historically, but Gandhi brought India to recognize the caste system was wrong and outlaw it. Now, as you can imagine, it's like outlawing slavery in the United States. We still have difficulties today in understanding in society that the blacks are completely equal to the whites. We still have problems with that. And slavery's been ended a long time. Well, India goes through that today. The caste system still is very strong in India, although it's illegal, and it is slowly working away from that. Jesuit missionaries in Paraguay noticed that the natives were rejecting the Christian faith because of the hatred they had for the Spanish conquerors. You don't have to know much history to know what happened to the Spanish when they went through South America, destroying cultures like the Incas and looting them. And so there was a huge hatred of the Spanish. And as a result of this, See, there was some of that in California, except there wasn't so much for the Spanish to loot. So that didn't really go on. But there was a real dislike because they established Spanish customs and that sort of thing. So as a result of that, the missionaries decided to move the natives away from the Spanish and educate them in what were called reductions, which a reduction means to move away. So they would educate them in these reductions. And you notice some of that in California with the missionary system, so that Father Serra would be working, like, for instance, in the Presidio in Monterey, and then build Carmel Mission quite a ways away for the Native Americans. They worked to separate the Native Americans from the soldiers in California as well. These reductions consisted of about 30 acres with a population of 150,000. The Indians lived a communal life, and military protection was in the hand of the villagers. So the 150,000 that formed the community, they had their own military to protect them there. They did not have the Spanish soldiers. There were no Spanish soldiers, only missionaries and Indians. And this proved to be a very successful approach. And again, this fell apart with the abolition of the Jesuits, okay? But when the Franciscans were put in position, Franciscans and Dominicans were put in position when the Jesuits were abolished. And so the Franciscans tended to try and use that when they came in California, separate the Indians from the soldiers. In 1616, because of the violence of the soldiers and the ravages of European diseases, the Indian natives were dying at an alarming rate. And so the importation of black slaves from Africa began in 1517. Black slaves were initially imported into the Americas to replace Native Americans. They were dying at too high a rate. For some reason, the Native Americans were more susceptible, particularly to smallpox, than were the Africans. And so they began to bring African slaves there. In Colombia, where 2/3 of the population, they were in fact slaves, and over 1,000 slaves were imported every month. There's a Jesuit there who worked in Cartagena, a saint, Peter Claver. Now, the major port was Cartagena, and most slaves came through there. He promised that he would be a servant of the blacks forever. He did that on the day he made his religious profession as a Jesuit brother. He met the boats at the dock and cared for the blacks. The slavers allowed him to do this because a healthy and living slave was valuable. A percentage of the slaves, I'm not sure whether I have it in the notes here, but a percentage of the slaves would die on every trip. And so when they come, those who were on the point of death, he would take physical care of and bring them back. So for that reason, he helped them make money. So they allowed him to come in and take care of the slaves and do what he could for them. He would beat the boats at the dock and care for the blacks. He learned the languages, the African languages, from the slaves coming over, and he taught them the faith, trying to improve their conditions. He baptized over 300,000 people. And in Peru, Martin de Porres did exactly the same thing. Martin de Porres was a Dominican brother. Each of these people would teach them as much as they could in the time allowed. Like they might have just one visit with a shipload of slaves. And they would teach them as much as they could and offer baptism to anyone who was interested. And many of the blacks would be baptized. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., one of the interesting things in Washington is the huge number of black Catholics. There are a large number of black Catholics in Washington, D.C. And one of the reasons is these people are descended from the slaves that were brought from Cartagena. to build the White House and the government buildings, and they had all passed through Martin de Porres. And so they came up Catholics. And there are many Catholics, particularly in Louisiana, where they found themselves when a black slave came to the United States and was Catholic or would present himself as Catholic, he would be allowed to live the faith if his owners were Catholics, like they would encounter in Louisiana. So Rome was very important. They continued to live their faith when they came into the United States. In the 1500s, a religious revival of the Catholic Church was evident in the growth of theological studies and the growing prestige of the great universities. There are many great universities, but at this time, theology became very interesting to people. You know, if we study history, we go through waves of interest in different kinds of studies. And at this point, theology became the big thing. And the University of Paris held the reputation it had had since the days of Thomas Aquinas. Louvain in Belgium concentrated on the teachings of St. Augustine. Alcalá and Salamanca in Spain brought a golden age to scholasticism. Scholasticism entered its complete fullness there in Spain. Rome actually was very important, and largely because of the number of Jesuit teachers there. Again, we cannot emphasize too much how good the Jesuits are at teaching. That's true today in their schools. For several centuries, the church had a number of great mystics and scholars, but actually no notable theologians. It's interesting, when the study of theology began to wane, the important people in the church at the time were mystics and scholars in different fields. Like if I were to take Ricci, a scholar in astronomy is really what made him. But theology was not too big. But what we see beginning in the 1500s is this became an age of theologians, and it was their job to show that the faith was reasonable, forming theological and biblical proofs for Catholic answers to questions being raised by the Protestants. We mentioned this earlier, that when the Catholics spoke, they would quote they would quote the popes and the papal letters. When the Protestants spoke, they would quote the Bible. As a result of that, they had no way of actually coming together in their understanding of theology. There are a lot of arguments, but not really much understanding. So now the Catholics began to go more into this theology, and we see this begin to develop. This is also a period that led to the printing of many excellent books, both for the education of laity and clergy. But I think this is one of the main reasons why theology grew. That in the days, if you go back, let's say you had a scholar like Thomas Aquinas at the University of Paris, well, a lot of other people wouldn't hear his work if you didn't, you didn't attend the University of Paris, you wouldn't have much acquaintance with him. Once these books began to be published, then you could have a theologian like Thomas Aquinas at the University of Paris, and his published books go everywhere, okay? But before this, remember, books were pretty well handwritten and stuff like that, so it was very difficult to get them. With this revival of serious study in the church, there was a growing respect on the part of both Catholic and Protestant theologians for the opinions of the other side. Now, Protestant theologians never went into the analysis of what the popes taught. However, the Catholics went into this deep analysis of Scripture, so that the Catholic theologians were able to speak to the Protestant theologians on the text. I'd like to give you an example example, because we had the gospel last Sunday. Last Sunday, we have the gospel where Jesus says to Simon Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." You notice it's future tense. This Sunday, we have the gospel where Peter tells Jesus, "You really don't have to go to the cross." And Jesus will say to Peter, "Get ye behind me, Satan." He calls Peter Satan. In the Protestant tradition, the promise of giving authority to Peter is violated by the way Peter tries to lead Jesus away from the cross, and therefore the authority does not pass on. Catholic tradition, the first authority is future. Then there's the incident of Peter with Satan, but the actual conferral of authority takes place after the resurrection of Jesus, where he tells Peter, "Feed my sheep, feed my lambs," that sort of thing. So what was going on there is, if we're talking about papal authority now, Catholics will formulate their arguments for papal authority out of the Bible, and Protestants will formulate their argument against papal authority out of the Bible. And that way, you see, there can be a real discussion. And if I don't agree with you, but can understand how you came to your position, then you and I can have a great discussion, even though we don't agree. We will respect one another because of the tradition we go on. So anyway, they still disagreed, but we're beginning to understand why each side held the views they did, and they were able to discuss the views in scholarly and civilized manners. Because if you look up to this point, oftentimes when they discussed views, they ended in international wars. So that isn't what's going on now. One of the most important figures of this period was a bishop of Geneva. This bishop of Geneva, Francis Desales, is generally regarded as one of a few bishops. Carlos, St. Charles Borromeo is also regarded as this kind of a bishop. He is a perfect example of what a bishop should be. Like, if God were to design bishops, he would use this man and Charles Borromeo as the model. But he was named the Bishop of Geneva. His family was a noble family, and he had a classical education in humanism and philosophy. His first assignment was in a city in France near the Swiss border. The town was actually completely Calvinistic. There's a lot of Calvinism in France, and particularly as you move closer to the Swiss border. And there were only 15 Catholics when he arrived. He wrote leaflets about the Catholic Church, and in his leaflets, he took an interesting track. He never, ever criticized the Protestant theologians, nor once did he attack the Calvinist. He explained what he believed. He says, "This is what I believe, this is why I believe it." And someone would say, "Well, this is what I believe." He never attacked what they believed. He simply said what he was about. I think it's, I think it's interesting in the United States, in politics, there's some people who their whole position in politics is who they're against. And there's some people, it's who they're for. Well, the same thing is true in ideas. There's some people who are just completely against things, certain things, and they define themselves in opposition rather than defining themselves in support. An example of that in the United States, past politics, was Joseph McCarthy, who defined himself as an anti-communist. You never knew what he was for, but it didn't matter. He was against communism, okay? Francis Desales brought about 25,000 people back to the church. Now remember, when he entered the town, there were 15 Catholics. They had all been Catholic original, but they were Calvinists, and he brought 25,000 of them back to the church. He was next appointed the bishop in Geneva, Switzerland. And I don't know how many of you have ever been to Geneva, but Geneva as a town I think we mentioned it earlier, they voted the entire town to be under the authority of Calvinism, John Calvin. And Geneva became, in fact, the Protestant Rome. It was like a Protestant Vatican. And if you go there, there's still statues and stuff of the great reformers all over. You go into the old Catholic churches, and all the statues, stained glass windows, that's all gone. But you know, it's all present in the basement. They didn't destroy the things or anything. They just cleaned the churches, and they became Calvinistic churches. But having been appointed there, he chose to live in Annecy, which is immediately across the border in France. It's in France, the city of Annecy. And you could walk about the length of this mission, and you'd be in Switzerland. And so he chose to live there because they had passed a law in Geneva that no Roman Catholic bishop could live in the town. So he lived in Annecy. He devoted himself to catechetics, and he concentrated on children. He quickly won their affection and attention. He wrote several books which proposed a devout humanism and stressing the value of the human person. Remember, the two things that we see rise at this time are humanism and I forget the name of the other one. The other one deals with the whole idea of ideas rather than what people say. And he stressed the value of the human person. He believed that every single person was called to holiness. And the interesting thing is at this time, if you were to look an example in the Catholic Church, probably the strictest order in the church is the Camaldolese, who are hermits. And each monk has his own individual yard and hermitage, and they work in them and they produce food. The food they produce is put out in a little turntable, and brothers collect it and prepare a meal and distribute it to all the monks and everything. And they had until recently, they've had a very strict time alone. Now they come together for certain meals and stuff like that. But they are the strictest order in the church. And if you were to go down to, let's say they would consider the least strict to be a diocesan priest. But as an example, if you are a member of the Camaldolese and you decide you're going to leave the Camaldolese and become a Franciscan, it used to be that was not possible because that was considered stepping down. However, if you were Franciscan and wanted to be a Camaldolese, you could get permission like that. And so they had them all graded as to how strict they thought they were. If you're a diocesan priest, you could go anywhere. If you're a Camaldolese, you could go nowhere. That was considered the top. Francis de Sales broke this. What Francis de Sales said is that the path to holiness is individual. He wrote a book, one of the most important ever written. It's called The Introduction to the Devout Life. And what his book basically said is that what would make a monk holy makes a married man not live up to his obligations. And what would make a married man's life successful is the very thing that would destroy the life of the monk. And he said a married man comes to holiness by being a husband, father, married man. A monk comes to holiness by being a monk, observing poverty, chastity, and obedience. And this, that sounds crazy, but this was a new idea. And if you were to look back historically, you'd find that, like a lot of the famous saints we know as married people, at a certain point, when their spouse died, they entered a monastery or a convent, or by mutual agreement, the two of them entered. One entered a monastery and one a convent. And so the idea that this holiness thing was a level thing. And he said that virtues required of a particular lifestyle were very often peculiar to that lifestyle. A widowed nobleman joined him in his work, and her name was Jane Frances de Chantal. She founded the Visitation Nuns. His great kindness and personality so won over the people of Geneva that after him, the Catholic bishop would again be allowed to live in Geneva and to stay in that city. But he concentrated his whole life on kindness as a bishop to these people, particularly to children. He would sit down. He encountered several vicious attacks, even physical, when he was in Geneva, and he just never reacted in any way. And he was able to bring it back. A friend of Francis de Sales was Pierre De Bruyle, and he was ordained a priest in 1599. He brought the oratory of St. Philip Neri to France and began a great reform of the French clergy. You have to remember that when you looked at the French government, they saw the government was three estates. It was the royalty, it was basically the king, but the royalty, and then it was the church, and then it was common people. But the royalty was basically the king, the church was basically the bishops, and the people was basically the landlords. And so that became sort of what was running France. And Philip Neri set about, Pierre De Bruyle set about reforming the priests. And what he did was get the priests to meet together in small groups. And so while they were diocesan priests and did not have vows, they lived together and their spiritual life developed. We've talked about this before, but one of the things that you notice that you have a lot more time for prayer and everything if you live the life of a hermit. You have a lot more time and everything to concentrate on God. But the fact of the matter is, a human being living alone tends to become crazy. And that's true to church history. So what he did was begin to gather the clergy in small groups. He was called to Spain by the church to help the Spanish Carmelites of St. Teresa come to France to found converts. Okay? So when he went to France, he was helping some of these Carmelites who'd been reformed by St. Teresa. He was helping them so that they could come as missionaries to France to found convents of Carmelites in France. And when the French Revolution came, these Carmelites were a very strong force in France during the entire French Revolution. In fact, there's a famous opera, I think it's called The Dialogues of the Carmelites, but it's built on the documents of these sisters that when they tried to end their life and try to get them to leave the convent. They maintained nuns were in convents because they were held prisoners by the church. And these nuns were saying no, they wanted to be a convent, and they were all guillotined. And it's preserved in, I think it's an opera and a ballet called Dialogues of the Carmelites. Beautiful presentation. There he came into contact with the spirituality of Teresa, and he wanted for priests in particular to deepen their spiritual lives, because the general opinion among Protestants was that Catholics were not very religious. One of the things remember the Protestants began as reformers, and so they were reforming the Catholic Church. And the reformers were very successful with people, calling them to a greater holiness. They were not that successful with the clergy. So we have the break with the Protestants and stuff. But as a result of this, many people looked at Catholics as people who could live any way they wanted, and they go to confession on Saturday, all their sins are gone, go to Mass and Communion on Sunday, and Monday go back into the world the way they wanted. And so they did not see Catholics as having any spiritual life. But one of the things that was going on with this Pierre De Bruyle, he began to try and concentrate on the spiritual life of Catholics themselves. And again, the great tool for this was Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. The eastern half of Canada was called New France, and the French began to send missionaries, Jesuits, into the area to the Algonquin, to the Huron, to the Iroquois, and to the Salish. I should mention just offhand, the community that I'm from is the Assiniboine, and the Assiniboine are Algonquin. Algonquin is a language family you find of Native Americans in North and South America, divided into many tribes. The Sioux are Algonquin, for instance, in the United States. A French Ursuline nun, Marie Gaia, who had been widowed and then entered the convent when her son was able to live without her, she, with 2 other Ursuline nuns, answered a request of the Jesuits for the formation of a convent. And they wanted to have women over here presenting the faith, as well as the Jesuit missionaries from France. So they asked the Ursuline nuns, and they came over. She built schools for the natives, learned their languages, and created the very first dictionaries for the education of missionaries. One of the most interesting things is if you go to Australia today and travel around the country, when you find national monuments in cities, they are almost inevitably to nuns. Because when Australia was opened, it was, as you know, a penal colony, and the British dumped their prisoners in Australia. But they didn't need any priests over there, largely because among the prisoners they dropped there was a large number of priests who were arrested in Ireland, during the Troubles, and sent into Australia. So they had that. But they had several women come over from England. And when they came over, they were nuns. And they started the very first schools, the very first hospitals. Everything that you and I would consider the social support structure for a society was all started by nuns who came into Australia and did this. And they're very highly honored there. They did a wonderful job. And so they created the dictionaries. It was a very difficult life that these Ursuline nuns found in Canada. And their work was extremely successful. Natives were greatly converted. 1648 marked the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, and great changes were taking place. The 30 Years' War was largely a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, and at this point, it's over. The idea that there would never be a united Christian Europe had finally been abandoned. That a lot of people look back with nostalgia at the Holy Roman Empire. Catholics presumed that we should take over all these nations, make them Catholic, and restructure the Holy Roman Empire. Protestants believed they should take the world, make everyone Protestant, and restructure this Holy Roman Empire. People felt this way. But at this point, the church realized the Protestants were not going to be defeated. War was not going to work. The Protestants, on the other hand, realized that the war was not going to work, but for a different reason. They realized because the Protestants were now beginning their fragmentation into different small churches and stuff. So they were having trouble getting organized within themselves. The center of activity was no longer the Mediterranean Sea, but the Baltic Sea and the Atlantic Ocean were where the action was. So these countries in Europe that were around, things moved away from there. They moved to the Atlantic and the Baltic Sea. And why? Because now we see the rise of the merchants and that sort of thing. And the Baltic Sea was where you're getting goods from India, China, silks, that sort of stuff. And the Atlantic is where you're getting the stuff that's coming from the natives and everything, tobacco, what do you call gold, and all that sort of stuff that's coming into the countries. There were trade routes developing, and colonization was taking place. So they began to try and establish themselves as in charge of these places. There were great disputes between the French and the Spanish, the Dutch and the English. And mixed in with this was the religious problem with Protestants and Catholics. Now, the conflict between the French and the Spanish was settled because they were both Catholic. So they settled it. It was settled by the Pope. It was carved out, and you see where the Spanish areas are, the French areas. Eventually, the Spanish and the Portuguese will carve out Brazil and set it up. So that was all set up. The Protestants, you find out that New York, which obviously you can tell is English because of York in England, was originally New Amsterdam, which was Dutch. And so we watched that fight go on, the different groups. Central and Eastern Europe became the suppliers and of foods and other materials to Western Europe. And the Catholic community saw this as a new mission land, okay? So Central and Eastern Europe rather than Southern Europe. Now, Central and Eastern Europe began to be seen as these areas where all this activity was taking place. And the church had largely ignored it. It was seen as sort of barbarian areas. So they began to send missionaries into this area. During this period, Spain saw its power declining, and France was emerging as the dominant power in Europe. Vincent de Paul, another friend of Francis de Sales and Pierre De Bruyle, felt that the strong Christian society would form if people were able to see the face of Christ in the poor, the needy, and the rejected. So he said that what we needed to do was to learn to see the face of Christ in people who need us. That's poor, this sort of thing. So they began to do that. And he wanted to organize a charitable work that would continue. He wasn't content, Vincent de Paul, to do the work he was doing. And I think when we look upon the church today, when you talk about lay people, probably the most influential individual is Vincent de Paul. He really got Catholics interested in taking care of people who were in need. He established a group of women known as the Ladies of Charity. They would eventually evolve into those nuns that wear the large hats. Where the large hats came from, incidentally, when they were forming their habit, they asked Vincent de Paul to design a veil for them. And so in his effort, Vincent de Paul pulled out of his pocket a folded handkerchief, and before he could do anything with it, he dropped it. And the folded handkerchief opened into that strange shape. And if you were to take a handkerchief, a starch handkerchief, and set it down, you'd see it naturally opens into that. So that became their headdress. And they went on. He organized a group of priests, and they became known as the Vincentians. Incidentally, the Vincentians were very big in the education of priests as well as doing this kind of work with the poor. In 1633, he helped someone, Louise Marillac, to organize the Sisters of Charity, who went out into society and served the poor. And just as a sign of his work, he rescued 40,000 abandoned babies in his lifetime and freed 1,200 slaves from the Turks. And of course, his work inspired the Vincent de Paul Society, which we have today, a lay organization that is serving the poor. So as we see coming out of this period now, a real revival of holiness among priests, of holiness in the lay people. We see a great revival, and this is all post-Trent. It all comes out of Trent, and the church begins to concentrate. If I could put it as in a single way, I would say the church moved from trying to make the world Catholic to the position where we're trying to make Catholics holy. And that was the move that you see at this point. So we'll call it there and pick it up there next week. Thank you very much.